This video is for chapter 12, which is on work. Um, this video is going to touch on some themes that were discussed in the previous chapter on family, particularly in regards of division of labor in households, although it also introduces some new ideas and concepts as well. So there used to be a real gender divide in regards to work. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with that traditional nuclear family model where the husband, father is the breadwinner, the wage earner, and then the wife and mother is a stay-at-home caretaker. And so in 1900, 1 out of 5 women worked for income, and today 58% of women do, most of whom are full-time. And it isn't necessarily only women who don't have children or young children, because 60% of women with children under age 3 work, 65% with 3 to 5-year-olds, and 73% of women with children ages 6 to 17. And a little over half of all married couples both are working for income. So although there isn't this clear gender divide anymore between, who is the wage earner and who is not in families, work is still viewed through this real gendered lens, because men are expected to work. And therefore, if they are, a failure in the work sphere, they can be what's considered unsexed, that it's unmanly to not be working. It's unmanly to not be successful in the area of work. It's unmanly to not be able to pay your own bills and take care of yourself. Women, although more of them are working, they still very much, at least in society, they are still viewed as this being optional. And, and for some parts of society, it is even seen as being suspicious if women prioritize work over family, if they seem to be more career focused than family focused. And so in this way, it's almost the opposite. Women are unsexed by success. A woman who is very successful in the career arena, particularly if she's single or childless, or even if she's not single and childless, there are concerns about, is she a good mother who's taking care of her children? The types of questions that we oftentimes don't ask about working fathers. So it's not necessarily seen as feminine to be overly career oriented, overly successful. And it's not seen as, it's seen as being non-masculine or unmasculine if you are a man and you're not successful in this area. Okay, I took a short pause there so I could turn off some notifications. So this gendered kind of ideology around work still exists, even though the empirical evidence suggests that it should not. And of course, if you're looking at it by states, the states do vary in terms of labor force participation. Sometimes people are very surprised that, in California, that is actually one of the states where there are less women in the workforce than average, and as well as most of the South. Probably in the South, of course, it probably has a lot to do with religious and cultural ideologies that are more likely to still promote this traditional household with this strict kind of separate spheres, where men are the wage earners and women are it meets with greater social approval to stay at home. In California, you definitely still probably have, people that are influenced by religion and traditional ideologies, but also just kind of given the number of wealthy people in California, especially some of the big cities, you can just imagine that there might be more households in that state where people can just afford to not have both people working. And then you can see that, states, a lot of the mountain states have the most women in the workforce. So, I think this is an interesting map, because it maybe is illustrating trends that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So why is it important that women work? certainly, for a lot of households, it's a necessity. The households will be more financially stable if both adults in the household, if they have two adults, that they're both working. If you take a step back and look at it on a more macro level, there is a link between a nation's economic growth and the rates of women's employment. Nations that have high rates of women's employment are usually stronger in most measures related to the economy. Now, the thing is these women who are not working aren't necessarily not working, because not all labor is counted as being official labor, official work. And so women in particular dominate what's called the informal labor sector. So this is, you're working, but you're working in the type of capacity that is not recognized by the government, right? You haven't registered yourself as a small business. You're not paying taxes on what you earn. And so in the eyes of the government, you aren't working, even though, you might be working, full time, but it's, so-called under the table work in the informal labor sector. And so this could be things like agricultural work. This could be things like selling goods at the market. If you're keeping children in your home, unlicensed daycare. If you're doing hair or nails or brows, but you don't have a license, but yet you regularly have clientele and this is how you're earning a living, all of that's informal labor sector. Men, of course, do work in the informal labor sector. They could be doing things like working on cars or types of lawn services. And if they're not registered as a business and paying taxes, they too are part of the informal labor sector. But they are less likely to be solely in that sector, and they are more likely to be part of the formal paid labor force, meaning their labor is being taxed. They're getting regular wages and regular salaries, and thus they're being officially counted in the statistics that we use when we talk about labor force participation. And so, and this, of course, isn't even getting into the fact that, housework is work, childcare, taking care of your children in your home is also work, even if it doesn't meet the definition of what we think of when we use the word work. But it's just worth noting that when I'm talking about women's labor force participation, I am specifically talking about the women who are recognized in the formal paid labor market. And so statistics like this, just kind of keep them in mind. It's measuring formal paid labor participation. And so you can kind of see that, at least 1990 to 2010, and of course in 2010, a lot of countries, including America, were experiencing a bit of an economic downturn. America was coming out of a recession. But you can see for a lot of countries, labor force participation increased for women. And you can see that America is a country, we have a pretty, sizable percentage of women that are in our labor force. There are some countries with a little less, there are some countries with a little more, but we're pretty normative in that regards. And that's despite the fact, like I said, traditionally in this society, femininity has not been associated with the concept of work, paid labor, the way that masculinity has. Historically, work has defined a man's identity. Men are just expected to have jobs. And you can say that to a certain extent, this is still true. This is why there are lagging numbers of men who choose to be stay-at-home fathers and house husbands, and how, in our media, we see people, making jokes about men that pursue that type of path in a way that they don't for women, because it is still seen as being unexpected. And so work status does affect masculinity. And we tend to think that men who are successful at work are generally successful in life. In masculinity studies, this is referred to as being a big wheel, that we send young boys the message that they should aspire to be big wheels, to be financially successful, to be wealthy, to have positions of authority and power. We send them these messages a lot clearly and concretely, more so than we do young girls, right? So the message we send young girls is often, you can be anything you want including, of course, someone that does not have a job in the paid labor force at all. You can be someone who is instead family focused. We don't send that type of message necessarily to young boys. Even today, what we're still pushing is this idea that you're supposed to be powerful and dominant in the economic sphere. And the thing is of course, not all men are big wheels. Like in a capitalist system, they can't be, all of them can't be. And this relates to the idea of compensatory masculinity that was discussed previously in the masculinity chapter, that by not being a big wheel, when a man is financially struggling, when he's unemployed or underemployed, sometimes he feels like he needs to compensate for this kind of loss of masculinity by overdoing masculinity in other ways. And so I found this interesting infographic, and we'll talk more about this later in this presentation, but overwhelmingly most CEOs are men, and not just men, but certain types of men. And so this is kind of based on a content analysis of, you know, who the current CEOs are, but you can kind of see that they have some qualities, some interesting qualities in common. But maybe the kind of most obvious quality that they have in common is the fact that so many of them, overwhelming number of them, are in fact men. But work is no longer solely the domain of men. Women's labor force participation is increasing, as I've already established, for a lot of families. Both adults are working for some amount of time outside of the home for a wage. And so this is the question that this chapter asks. If women now have equal rights in the workplace, why aren't they as successful as men at work? And so this chapter begins with kind of discussing the changing workplace for women in terms of specific occupations. And so the occupation that they focus on are stewardesses. And so it's worth noting that originally, stewards have been men, and they talked about, especially if you're thinking about on trains and buses, it was men of color, particularly African-American men. But as flying became more of an option, stewards were white men, and they said that that was because, you know, they felt like this was a masculine job, you know, protecting people, you know, in the skies, and that especially for class purposes, they also needed to be white men to be kind of seen as being authority figures. And this was largely the case, of course, until, like so many things, you know, World War II, where you know, men went off to fight in the war, and stewards were replaced by stewardesses. And when it became more common for a woman to have this position than a man, then the expectations and perceptions around it also shifted. You know, now, of course, it was more about female spectacle, sexual objectification, being friendly, being perky, being cute, being attractive, you know, the types of qualities that were not at play when it was men as stewards. And at the same time, there's this shift in perception. There's also this shift in value and pay. And your book talks about this in regards to what they call the androcentric pay scale. Jobs that are dominated by men are paid more. It probably has a lot to do with the fact that men, of course, the male identity, masculinity is associated more with work. There's the expectation that in a family, a man's supposed to be the breadwinner, a woman is not. So if a job is held by men, then it's going to be a better paying job. And it isn't just, it's not just stewards versus stewardesses that you can kind of see those distinctions between, you know, value and financial compensation and the gender compensation of the occupation. We've talked about this in regards to educators, teachers. You know, we've talked about this in regards to nurses. Your book introduces this concept in regards to other positions, like the early computer engineers, for instance. You know, I thought that was pretty interesting that, you know, this work you know, used to primarily be done by women, and it was seen through this gendered light, and it wasn't necessarily very highly compensated. Now, of course, it's primarily done by men, and now it has a much higher compensation. And so all of this, of course, is contributing to a concept that we've already discussed, the feminization of poverty. Women can work full-time just like men, but oftentimes, especially if they're working in jobs that are dominated by women, those jobs aren't as well paying. And that increases the amount of women that are working but are poor, that are part of the working poor class. And then what this chapter introduces, the concept of the masculinization of wealth. If jobs held by men are better paid, then that allows them to do things with their money like invest, which increases their wealth, which leads to that wealth gap between men and women. But it isn't just the difference in how they're valued and how they're compensated. At least, when they're talking about the world of the 1960 flight attendant, stewardess, they are sexually objectified, they're harassed, they're held to standards that, are sexist and ageist and racist. Your book talks about, the weigh-ins. It talks about, the rules that they required regarding, not just weight, but hair, makeup, the fact that they were, supposed to respond to being sexually objectified and sexually harassed, that, they weren't expected to get upset about it. They weren't expected to like chastise, the customer. And that was kind of the world of being a stewardess back then. And of course, lawsuits changed a lot of things. They talked about, once the Civil Rights Act was passed, it opened up the ability for the stewardess to do things like, to file lawsuits in regards to how they were treated, the discrimination they were facing. But then also, Celio Diaz was the first man to file a gender discrimination lawsuit, because, at some point they stopped hiring men to be stewards and flight attendants. And so he, sued for the right to be a flight attendant and to have male flight attendants. So of course, lawsuits are, an answer to this. But even when these types of policies and laws are in place, and, and this is why in previous chapters we've established we don't live in a patriarchy, we live in a modified patriarchy. Technically, we do have equal protection and equal rights under the law, but it is hard to enforce these laws. And a great example of this is the gender pay gap. So there are laws that require equal pay for equal work, but this has been really hard to enforce, just because, it isn't always clear, how people's pay is established. It isn't always clear, who is getting paid what. The Lilly Ledbetter Act was passed at the beginning of Obama's first term, that at least allowed people to be aware of like what other people in their company, what other people in their position made. But being aware that you're making less isn't the same thing as your company being required to pay you an equal amount. And the last time that this type of legislation was in front of Congress, the Paycheck Fairness Act of 2014, it wasn't passed. And so we do have this pay gap, 82 cents to $1. And you can see that the gap, at one point it was shrinking, and then it kind of increased again, and then it's kind of largely held stable. And I give you a whole set of videos, largely funny, tongue-in-cheek videos, kind of making this point, that women are paid less than men, even when they're doing similar work, even when they're in similar positions. And that 82 cents to $1 is not true if you then start splitting women up by race. It's less if you're a Black woman. It's the lowest if you are a Latina. And so, let's just consider, what are the consequences of that wage gap, right? It impacts your ability, obviously, to spend money, but it impacts your ability to invest, to buy a home. It impacts your credit score and how, to what extent are you deemed credit worthy. It impacts your ability to get, loans, be them education loans or, whether it is a housing loan. It impacts, the size of your pension, it impacts how much Social Security you'll be eligible for when you retire. So it is important, that 18 cent on average is an important gap. It adds up. And, the gap itself varies like everything else. you know, state by state. And you can kind of see that there's some states that are a little better. There's some states that are a little worse. And some of it also has to do with age. You know, younger people, if you have a state where most of your workers are younger, the gender gap is less. Probably because they have equal amounts of or more equal amounts of education and experience. If you have states where your labor force is older, then the gender pay gap increases. And what's amazing is, you know, it doesn't really matter what we're trying to hold constant. If we're holding age constant, if we're comparing within racial groups, if we're comparing within educational levels, there is this persistent gender gap. You know, it can shrink, it can increase, but what's amazing is it doesn't ever go away. Like even when you're holding like, you know, race and age and education constant, you know, they can never get it closer than, you know, still being a couple of cents away. And so that just kind of suggests that there really is something going on here. So what is happening? What is causing this gender gap? So we're going to talk about three primary causes, not necessarily in the order that you see them on the slides. We're going to talk about what role does gender discrimination and sexism play? What role does gender job segregation play? And what role does the motherhood penalty play? So gender job segregation, the idea that men and women are concentrated in different jobs, and those different jobs, because of the androcentric pay scale, mean that men who are working in male jobs have higher pay than women who are working in female-dominated jobs. And some research does suggest that about 90% of the explanation for the wage gap does lie in the prevalence of this type of sex segregation among occupations. And so, you know, it raises the question, you know, why do women then choose lower paying jobs? You know, are they choosing lower paying jobs? What would be the benefits of that? And we'll talk about that more in a second. But it's worth noting that if we're just looking at this type of androcentric pay scale and this gender job segregation, why does it exist? You know, a lot of it has to do with what I discussed, that kind of association with men and the expectation that men should make money that is sufficient, you know, in terms of it being a family wage that they can raise a family on. And traditionally, women, even when they were working for a wage, their incomes were seen as being supplementary to their husbands, or they were seen as being temporary in the sense, you know, you're working this job, but you're not really going to have a household on this job. Like, you know, eventually you will get married and your husband's going to be the primary breadwinner. And so that type of that pervasive type of notion kind of trickled into how we pay men and women. Because if you actually looked at some of these jobs, you know, they don't necessarily always, they don't really differ in terms of skills, although the skills themselves are different. They don't necessarily differ in terms of amount of education required. There's some jobs that we've increased the educational requirements for, like childcare workers, although we haven't in fact increased, you know, the pay associated with being a childcare worker. And especially if you're talking about jobs that don't require post-secondary education, that distinction between blue-collar jobs predominantly held by men that pay working class or better wages versus pink-collar jobs that are predominantly held by women who don't have post-secondary degrees, and they usually pay minimum wage, making them more jobs associated with, you know, the working poor. And there are some arguments that suggest that's because a lot of these pink collar jobs in particular are the types of work that women do at home. And it's just that kind of devalued care work, which we'll come back to that concept in a second. So are women choosing these jobs? Are they being pushed towards these jobs? What is going on? What are the causes of gender job segregation? Well, you know, first of all, there are the cultural beliefs. You know, that we're raised with this concept of gender roles and gender norms, and this then filters into our expectations regarding men and women's work roles. that we see some type of work, especially if it's dirty, especially if it involves, labor, with your hands, we tend to see this type of work as being, pertinent to men, versus if it involves care work, if it involves nurturing, if it involves, taking care of people, we're more apt to see this as women's work. And your book does note, of course, that cultural beliefs vary by time and place. And I like to say that because, there's nothing about these jobs that are inherently for men or for women. In class, I often make the joke, name one job that only one sex can do. And really, in all my years of teaching this class and having this discussion, the only one that, students have landed on are things related to biological functions, right? So only a woman can be a surrogate, a surrogate mother. Only men can be, only cisgender men can be, sperm donors. Only cisgender women could possibly, and as well as transgender men, but only people that have the biological capacity to produce milk can be like a wet nurse. I don't know if that's actually a job that still exists in today's world, but for the most part, a lot of these jobs that we say are men's jobs and women's jobs, pure social construction, which means we can construct a different definition of it if we wanted to over time. But because we have these expectations that some jobs are for men and some jobs are women, we oftentimes socialize boys and girls, teenage boys, teenage girls, to have certain skills and experiences that then make them better fits for these men's jobs and women's jobs. Think about who's more likely to get a toolkit at age 5, or, a play toolbox, probably a boy child as opposed to a girl child. Who's more likely to get a baby doll and be taught, oh, rock the baby, probably a little girl as opposed to a little boy. Who's more likely when they're in middle school and high school, has a part-time job, taking care of kids for the neighborhood as a babysitter. Probably a teenage girl as opposed to a teenage boy. And so, these experiences build, these skills build. And so then what happens is then when you're an adult, you maybe have kind of, without even realizing it, you maybe have kind of cultivated a job history and a job skill set that makes you a better hire and a better fit for a women's job or versus a man's job. And a lot of this, of course, is, once again, it's socially constructed. It doesn't have to be this way. We assume that women are nurturing. We pressure women to be nurturing. We put them on the path to being nurturing, at a young age. And thus the fact that a lot of women do wind up in fields that involve emotion work or care work, that's not necessarily surprising. It doesn't mean, though, that men can't do those types of jobs. It doesn't mean that men don't have those types of capacities. It does mean that we have not necessarily groomed them for those types of careers. Your book also notes that gender also intersects with other characteristics that lead to stratification in the workforce, race, social class, sexual orientation. Those types of social identities also come into play and kind of shape, once again, our experiences and the skills that we bring to the table when we're looking for work as adults. And so your book talks about the socialization hypothesis, right? The idea that we are socialized, we're socialized to have, skills and characteristics that make us more or less a better fit for these jobs that have been subjectively defined as being men's and women's jobs. And that's what is leading to this occupational sex segregation. There's also the role of employers. To what extent do they feel comfortable hiring men as opposed to women, women as opposed to men for certain positions. Your book talks about this as the employer selection hypothesis, that employers just feel comfortable and are more apt to hire men for jobs deemed masculine, women for jobs deemed feminine. And then, of course, there is the selective exit hypothesis, which your book talks about just in terms of, you know, there is data that suggests that when people have jobs that are gender atypical, meaning that they are the minority in that occupation in regards to their gender, they're more likely to leave that job, and they're more likely to leave it more quickly than someone who's gender typical. And they don't really necessarily, there are a lot of factors that can play into that. One factor that I'm going to introduce specifically, because I want you to kind of think about this, is sexual harassment. So sexual harassment can take many forms. You know, it can be verbal, it can be nonverbal, it can be physical harassment, you know, on the basis of sex, which isn't the same thing as sexual interest, right? You know, people aren't necessarily doing it because they're interested in you sexually, but it's the fact that they are treating you differently. They are harassing you in some way because of your sex, because of your gender. So that's kind of the typical form we think of, but there are two additional forms of sexual harassment. Quid pro quo, the something for something. I'll give you a raise if you go on a date for me. You know, if you want to get the good accounts, you need to be willing to flirt with me as your boss. You know, this is the obviously sleazy form of sexual harassment that people are becoming more and more aware of. You know, this is unacceptable. This is the type of sexual harassment that exists in Hollywood in particular, that, you know, the Me Too and Time's Up movement kind of shone a light on. But in regards to that selective exit hypothesis, I want to make sure that you understand a more subtle form of sexual harassment and the type of sexual harassment that continues to exist today, that continues to pop up in lawsuits, because this is the type that I think sometimes people are less aware of, and it's called a hostile work environment. So this is where you create a work environment that's uncomfortable, that's not conducive to someone being able to do their job to the best of their abilities, and it has a lot to do with how you treat them in regards to their sex. So, you know, if you are a female barber and you work in an all-male environment, and, you know, they're you know, playing softcore porn in the break room, and all the barber stations have up, you know, Playboy centerfolds and Penthouse magazine centerfolds, you can make an argument for hostile work environment. It isn't just, of course, for women. Men can make an argument for hostile work environment. If you're working in an office setting and, you know, it's all women, you know, they're always, you know, talking about, you know, their sexual experiences, you know, men's penis sizes. I don't know, what are some other things, you know, their periods. You know, once again, you can make this argument that, you know, I am experiencing a hostile work environment on the basis of my sex. And so, you know, research does suggest that sexual harassment does contribute to ongoing occupational segregation between genders. It makes people who are gender atypical for an occupation, it makes them less likely to maybe apply for a job and accept a job. And then it makes them less likely, if they are experiencing hostile work environment, it makes them less likely to stay on the job for a prolonged period of time. Which is what the selective exit hypothesis is getting at. And there has been research, particularly in fields like the military, military officers, firefighters, police officers, that have combined those two, the selective exit hypothesis and the hostile work environment, as to why women leave those fields at a much higher rate comparative to men. It's not the job itself, it's how they are treated on the basis of the fact that they are a minority in terms of their gender identity. So moving on to a second explanation for the gender pay gap, and this one is, you know, what role does gender discrimination and sexism play? So, you know, there can be some discriminatory practices in hiring and promotion. And this kind of relates to the employer selection hypothesis. For people who study this, some, you know, the argument is, you know, is this the result of bias, right? Where people are biased against people of a specific sex, of a specific gender identity, and thus just don't want to hire them for a job, even though they are capable for that job, even though they have the requirements for that job. And that's clearly and obviously wrong. What's harder to prove, but some people suggest is more likely, is the role of homophily, where people prefer to hire people like them. And this is where past sexist, past sexual discrimination comes into play. Because if a lot of managers, upper management, if a lot of them are men, particularly white men, and homophily is coming into play, and there are no policies pushing them to hire people who don't look like them, then what results is they hire people they are most comfortable with, which are people who look like them. And this might lead to there being gaps in minority hiring as well as women being hired. When trying to prove gender discrimination, like I said, it's like all policies, it's tough. Just like the policies are tough to enforce, it can also be difficult to prove, that you have been truly discriminated against. Because multiple people will apply for the job, and if they're all qualified, then employers do have a good deal of leeway in who they choose to give the job to. We can kind of look to some of the trans men experiences, what their narratives have suggested, right? That oftentimes they talk about after transitioning from being a cisgender woman to a transgender man, they talk about how their experiences in the labor force have improved, how people take them more seriously, they're more apt to respect their authority, to look to them for expertise. Similarly, a few years ago, a news story went viral where a man who had a name that was associated with women, I want to say maybe it was Ashley or Kelly, he noticed how he would be treated and, how he was being overlooked during his hiring process. And he basically changed his resume and his applications, he and his LinkedIn profile, so that instead of going by his first name, he went by his first initial and then his obviously male middle name, and then he wrote about his experience, how, I think he was in the field of engineering, but how like almost overnight, the number of people responding to him in a positive fashion, in terms of being interested in working with him in recruitment or offering him a job, how it increased. So, there are some non-systematic first-person narratives that suggest that even though we don't necessarily always do a great job of capturing to what extent does this gender discrimination exist, it clearly does. And it exists despite the fact, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of sex. We've talked about this in previous chapters. And so, what beyond discrimination, if we're thinking about it in terms of other ways in which, sex can impact how people are treated on the job, whether they get the job, whether they get the promotion, your textbook asks you to consider, the ways in which sexism, that systematic degradation and devaluation of women, and mistreatment of women, how does that come into play? And they talk about it in three forms. They talk about it in forms of hostile versus benevolent sexism, which we've discussed in previous chapters, right? But, people can have hostile sexist experiences on the job, where they're clearly discriminated against, they're put in dangerous situations, they are sexually harassed. All of that is hostile sexism. And then there's that benevolent sexism, where maybe your boss doesn't give you the feedback that you need in order to improve your work because he assumes that as a woman, you are sensitive and he doesn't want to hurt your feelings. But this winds up being long-term detrimental. Or, they don't give you like the late night shifts because they consider it to be dangerous for women. They don't give you the accounts that require a lot of travel because they assume you don't want to go away from your family. But long-term, this holds back your career. So that's benevolent sexism. And so, they talk about, how they play out in different ways. They talk about, your textbook talks about, how, especially for hostile sexism, is likely to happen in occupations where women is seen as a symbolic threat, where men are concerned that they are going to enter the occupation in large numbers. And then think about what we've established is the trend. When women enter occupation, the occupation becomes devalued. It results in less pay. So men who currently have that occupation sometimes push back against women entering the occupation in large numbers, because they view them as a threat to their kind of financial security and the value that their profession is currently offering them. Another kind of form sexism takes is double bind. Both sexism and androcentrism factor in here. It's this idea that in order to be successful at her job, oftentimes a woman needs to do masculinity. But then in order to be liked and accepted by her boss, her colleagues, maybe clients, she also needs to do femininity, that feminine apologetic that we talked about before. It is a very tricky balance that women are constantly having to kind of figure out. Be too masculine and you're unliked, and people lash out at you for that. Be too feminine and you are likely going to be perceived as being ineffectual and not great at what you do. And so that's the second form. And then the third form is just that preferential treatment for men. And so when your book is discussing this, they introduce a lot of concepts related to glass. And I'm going to introduce like one or two more. So oftentimes we talk about women in the glass ceiling, that women are able to experience a certain amount of mobility in their profession, and then they hit this invisible barrier that prevents them from rising to the top. And people oftentimes point to the glass ceiling as an explanation as to why there aren't more female CEOs, given the number of women who earn an MBA. At this point, it's more women than men, given the number of women who are middle level managers, because that's starting to become more women than men. But CEOs are overwhelmingly men. Upper level positions, our executive positions, are overwhelmingly men. And that's because, there isn't this clear promotional path. So the glass ceiling suggests you rise up to a certain point, you can see the higher position, right? That's the glass aspect, right? You can see it, but there's this invisible barrier preventing you from getting it. Now, your book talks about another glass concept, glass cliff, because for women who do get those kind of top executive positions, they oftentimes get them when the company is failing or in trouble. So it's like, and it's worth noting that this has been shown also with racial minorities, that female CEOs, racial minority CEOs, they're likely to be granted that position when a company isn't doing well, because at that point the company almost has nothing to lose. Like if you manage to save the company, great, but it's kind of almost setting, and that's the idea that you're on a cliff, like it's a precarious position. The company isn't stable, so if you aren't able to save it, you probably will be blamed for the company failing and going under, even if it was clearly trending that way already. A good example of that type of experience in regards to women is Marissa Mayer, who at the time, some years ago when she was made CEO of Yahoo was already struggling, in terms of keeping up with Google. This was early on when Google and Yahoo were like in competition with one another. Now, of course, Yahoo's dead and, Google is Google. But so at the time when they made Marissa Mayer CEO, and it was a big deal that she was a woman and was put in charge of this company, the company was already in this precarious position. She almost would have had to have done amazing work to save Yahoo. And then the fact that she does not, the really detrimental thing about the glass cliff phenomena is then sometimes this is used as a future justification for not having women, for not having minority CEOs, because there are only so few of them. And if the few of them have been in charge of companies that were already struggling, it makes it seem like they can't be successful in the position, which is of course just not fair. A concept that I want to introduce in regards to that glass concept that isn't discussed by your book, but has been discussed by previous textbooks I've used, is the concept of glass walls. And so if you think about glass walls, right, it's the idea there is no ceiling, so you can rise up as high as you possibly can. However, you can't escape that department. So basically what that's saying is that there are some departments that are overwhelmingly women, and women can rise to the top of that department. But oftentimes, because those departments are not fully valued, and not necessarily integral to the company's overall functioning, it doesn't help you then become like a chief executive. Instead, you're just at the head of that department. Probably the best example of that is HR. HR is overwhelmingly dominated by women. And so the head HR, the head HR person is almost always going to be a woman, but no one's going to then take a person that has a lifetime of that experience and be like, oh yes, you will also be a good CEO of this company. Instead, you're able to rise to the top, but in this kind of limited capacity. Which means that there is going to be some constraints on your earning power, and there are going to be some constraints in terms of your level of authority in the company. Now, in regards to the glass ceiling, there are debates about, is it in women's best interest to like lean in and play by the rules and try to break that ceiling? There's been some people that have argued that, with gender discrimination and sexism, perhaps this isn't even just like a worthwhile goal for most women to consider. They're probably going to be put in a position where, they're going to be in a glass cliff situation, and that's precarious and that's harmful for, women's kind of long-term, occupational success. So maybe they should lean back. There was a book called Leaning Out that discussed how, women just kind of exit this kind of fast track, upwardly mobile career pathway. They kind of just tap out altogether. And so this is something that comes up. Before we leave women behind and we start focusing more on the concepts that relate to men, sticky floor. And it's worth noting, sticky floor doesn't just apply to women, but women are more likely to be in these positions. And these are just positions where there really is no pathway to mobility. Like there isn't a clear path about like, how do I get a better job from this job? It basically becomes a dead end job. You're stuck, and thus the word sticky. So now going to men. The concept that relates to kind of how men excel in female-dominated positions when they are the gender atypical person is glass escalator. The glass escalator concept is the idea that men are more quickly promoted in female-dominated fields. And the two best examples of this traditionally have been education, where given the number of female teachers, the number of male principals and male school superintendents is disproportionately high. And if you look at their careers, what you often see is men are more quickly promoted and led to on the administrative track, more so than their female counterparts. This also exists in the world of nursing. Given the number of women who are nurses versus men, the number of men who are nursing managers is disproportionately high. And the phenomena is called glass escalator because if you think about an escalator, you step on, and then you literally don't have to pick your feet up again. And you eventually will find your way, at the top, right? The escalator just takes you on up to the next floor. And that's the idea, is that, men step into these female-dominated fields in an entry-level position, but they much more quickly rise to the top of the field than their female counterparts. I'll save glass closet for the moment. Let me talk about glass cellar, glass floor, because the other thing about glass, in addition to being invisible and perhaps hard to break if it's tough glass like the glass ceiling glass, is that it's also slippery. So sometimes you'll hear people refer to glass floor or glass cellar in regards to the fact that some men get there are male-dominated positions that aren't actually that high-paying, and they're very dangerous. And it is worth noting that 90% of occupational deaths do happen to men. Men are much more likely to be in positions where their jobs have a certain amount of workplace safety issues. And so these jobs are dangerous. They may or may not have mobility out of them, but the kind of key thing is you are likely to slip and get hurt. So, you know, that's that idea of it being a glass floor or glass cellar. Before we leave all of these glass metaphors behind, let's discuss one final one. And this one is one from your book, and that's glass closet. And it's the idea that, you know, for both men and women, lesbian and gays, there is the sense that in some occupations, it might be necessary to hide your sexual orientation, to hide your sexual identity because of, you know, heterosexism, homophobia, preconceptions that people might have around sexual minorities that might hinder you from experiencing mobility, from being granted, from getting hired, for you know, getting promotions. And so thus you have, even if you're not closeted in your real life, to a certain extent, you might have to be closeted in your work life. Which brings me now to my final explanation, and that is, you know, the role of motherhood penalty. So, and this refers back to our last chapter. Work-life balance, you know, there is this conflict between our work and our home lives. And part of that has a lot to do with, in this country, there's this concept of the ideal worker norm. What does it mean to be an ideal worker? That you're someone that's able to, at least during the time you're at work, to fully dedicate and focus your time and energies on your work, to commit to the job for a long, you know, for the long term, to not have any expected, you know, absences or breaks away from the job. And that becomes really hard for women, and particularly for mothers, existing mothers, soon to be mothers, expected mothers. It's hard for them to do this because you've got to take some time away to have your child. And then even once your child exists, you know, there are going to be unexpected things to come up, illnesses, you know, school issues, doctor's appointments. And so all of this means that for, you know, mothers cannot be the ideal workers. And because they cannot be the ideal workers logistically, and employers see them through this lens of you're not going to be the ideal worker, that means that women face a motherhood penalty. And it says, see the next slide, but I think what I did was I just put my points from the next slide on this slide. Yes. And so the motherhood penalty is the fact that women lose earnings because of employer discrimination. Mothers, they believe that mothers will be less devoted to their jobs, and therefore they should be paid less, or perhaps not even hired altogether. Although, you know, keep in mind that is illegal. You can't not hire someone because they're a mother. You can possibly pay them less because there aren't laws that promise equal pay. And so that is the case. Mothers make less money than fathers. And we'll talk about fatherhood premium in a second. Mothers make less money than single women, particularly single women who are too old to have a child. Which is where we sometimes start to see the gender pay gap narrow. And so this preconceived notion that mothers aren't going to be good workers, and I'm not even going to say good workers, I'm going to say that they're not going to be able to uphold that ideal worker norm, you know, it is partially supported by the fact that women do have to take time away from work for their families. Like I said, they have to bear children, you know, if they're able to, if they want to take some time off in their child's early years or, you know, early months even, you know, and then of course, like I said, doctor's appointments, you know, children get sick, you know, there's school issues and unexpected days off. You know, think about what is happening in 2020 in regards to the pandemic. And so all of this takes away from the time that they're able to dedicate to work, thus making them not ideal. And so modern mothers, they do pay a steep price for having children, while modern fathers generally do not. Because like I said, it is expected that men are going to have children, but it isn't expected that they are going to disrupt their lives to care for them, because that's what their presumed wives are doing. So instead, what we can often see for men is that they will have a fatherhood premium, that they will make a little bit more money, because the expectation is, unlike a single, unattached man who would leave a job, who would, quit unexpectedly. The expectation is men are going to be more loyal and more stable to their job when they have mouths to feed and people to take care of. And so the job rewards them, but it rewards them with the expectation that they aren't going to divert a lot of time, energy, and attention away from their job to their families. Because while mothers are automatically put on the mommy track, men are only put on the daddy track if they make it a point to make it clear that they are prioritizing spending time with their family as opposed to spending time on the job. So the mommy track is almost automatic for women. You become a mother, and for a lot of companies, it almost is expected that you are now not going to be the ideal worker. If they did have you on a pathway, leading you up to upper middle management, they might take away some of those responsibilities and give them to coworkers who are not mothers. Fathers, because the expectation is to be a good father is just to be a breadwinner. Men who become fathers are not automatically placed on the daddy track. Men who are placed on the daddy track are men who push back against the ideal worker norm expectation by doing things like not coming in on the weekends to work because they're spending time with their families, not staying late at a company event, or wining and dining the clients because they go home to take care of their family, taking time off of work in order to more evenly share childcare responsibilities with their partner. Those men who engage in that type of activity are more apt to then be placed on the daddy track, which is similar to the mommy track, right? You now are no longer being considered for those upper level, better compensated, more powerful positions. Going the wrong way. So have we passed policies to combat this? Very, very little. There are governmental entities like the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is supposed to help address issues in discriminatory hiring, but it can be very hard to prove that the reason why you didn't get a job was because of your sex, or because of your race, or because of your age. Affirmative action, this also was meant to address gender inequity, not just racial inequity in the workplace. And affirmative action it can take a variety of forms. Oftentimes people are thinking about it in terms of quotas, where you set aside positions for people of a specific group. And it's worth noting that these type of set-asides, especially in the world of education, these have been deemed unconstitutional since the 1970s. Bach versus UC Davis was a Supreme Court case for that. So the type of affirmative action programs that are more likely still in existence are preferences and goals. Preferences are everything else being comparably equal. So like, let's say you more or less have a person that has the expertise and skills to have this job, and another person that has the expertise and skills to have this job. Then the preference would be that you give it to the underrepresented, the individual that represents the underrepresented group, whether that's on the basis of gender or the basis of race, ethnicity. Goals is even more, or not more, goals are even less concrete. These are companies and schools. This is kind of their stated goal. Like they might say something like, a company might say, we want to increase the women that are part of our middle management employee tier. We want to increase that number by 10%. So it's just kind of putting it out there that that's kind of what they're working towards, but it's not necessarily like a concrete, like we're holding ourselves, to this standard. And it's worth noting that initially white females were the early beneficiaries of affirmative action gender-based policies, both on college campuses as well as in workplaces. And as their numbers began to reach parity with men, especially in colleges, Policies then shifted to focus more so on race. But after several successful Supreme Court challenges to using race on the basis as the basis of affirmative action policies, particularly for colleges, there now has been an increasing focus on socioeconomic status. So, you know, preferences and goal programs related to increasing the number of students from poor, working class backgrounds in certain higher education settings. It's worth noting that affirmative action in workplaces, it's been less uniformly practiced and also less systematically challenged. Family-friendly workplace policies. I had this discussion in the last chapter, but it's worth saying again, there is no federally mandated paid maternity leave. This can vary by state, this can vary by company, but there is no federal mandate that says that a company has to offer paid maternity leave to its employees, let alone paid paternity leave. So states and individual businesses can enact their own laws and policies, but there's no federal level legislation. And America is one of the few countries, especially if you're thinking of fully industrialized nations, that lack this type of policy. You know, what we have had since 1993 is the Family and Medical Leave Act. And it provides protected leave, meaning you can't be fired for up to 12 weeks if you have to take time off for yourself or because of family related health issues. This, however, is unpaid. So people's capacity to utilize FMLA is somewhat also related to their ability to withstand not receiving a paycheck for that amount of time. And so in this way, you know, I mean, I guess it's better than nothing, but it certainly isn't very helpful to the kind of struggling middle class, working class families out there, you know, who have to decide, you know, do I take unpaid leave if I live in a state where the paid maternity leave isn't offered? Do I take unpaid leave and possibly financially struggle during this time period? Or do I not take the leave? And of course, that raises additional issues around health, around safety of children, around the need for affordable daycare and childcare services. And it's just worth noting, because this is where your book ends, is, you know, with the new economy, you know, we've spent so long focusing on this gap between men and women in the economy, and women need to catch up with men, women need to catch up with men. But then what happens when men aren't even doing as well as they used to? Now, of course, is an even more problematic situation. And so it's just worth noting that there are a lot of current problems in the US workplace. You know, there's the dual labor market where you have jobs that are part of the primary labor market and, you know, your so-called good jobs with salaries and benefits. And then you have jobs in the secondary market, you know, and these are your minimum wage jobs that lack benefits. There are issues around workplace safety. There's the extent to which workplace alienation is an issue where people just feel disconnected from their work and you know, on kind of a psychosocial level. The McDonaldization of jobs, where jobs are becoming so routine, you know, that it kind of saps the creativity and the autonomy out of the job. Your book explicitly talks about the rise of temping in the gig economy. You know, it gives people flexibility, but it also takes away financial and job security. And then particularly because it lacks benefits, especially retirement benefits, it raises concerns about, you know, what is this going to look like when people are 60, 70, 80 years old? You know, are they going to be able to retire? Are we going to have a society where we have a bunch of poor older people? Unemployment, you know, you know, not even post-pandemic, but, you know, courtesy of the pandemic, after experiencing some years of growth after the recession, you know, now we are back to having very high unemployment levels. And really the numbers have been worse than what was even suggested, because a lot of that job growth was low wage recovery, meaning people had jobs, but given their skills, given their education, they are what we call underemployed, and that's never ideal. You know, we've talked about there's institutional discrimination, and job segregation. You know, we focused on it explicitly in regards to gender, but know that that also exists in regards to race and ethnicity. And then the decline of unionization has made it harder for workers to organize and demand protection and rights as workers. So, you know, all of this is just to say, you know, women don't have equal rights in the workplace. They're not as successful as men at work. And then just the work arena itself is just kind of going through a real period of crisis. And, you know, I really like the fact that when your book ends on page 354, or when this chapter ends on pages 354 to 355, you know, I love the fact that they say there's this saying, money doesn't buy happiness. So why focus on it? Well, that's because it buys everything else except maybe happiness. So it has to be a focus in society, particularly a capitalist society. And that's why the gender pay gap matters, because it may not buy happiness, but it does impact things like your ability to pay for education, to take care of your children, to own your own home, to build, you know, your wealth portfolio, to be able to retire comfortably. So it does matter. And that is the end of chapter 12 on work.